Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be doing the first installment in a new series I recently came up with, which I am calling Thematic Rambles, in which I'm able to discuss books a little bit more in depth when I have the inkling to do so. Essentially, I'm going to use this series to be able to discuss in depth really great symbolism and themes and motifs and things I see in books that I really enjoyed, that make me think a lot. It's not really a review, I want to make that clear, because I'm not really going to be talking about whether or not I like the book. Most of the time when I make these videos, it's because I enjoy the book. Every once in a while there may possibly be a book I just want to rant about that I'll utilize this series to do, but that's going to be very rare. It's going to be primarily books, probably primarily classics, though not always, where I just have a lot of thoughts and I just need to share them and I don't have time to share them in a wrap up. So we're going to utilize these. So for this first installment, I'm actually going to be discussing the book that prompted the creation of this series, The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy, because I have a lot of thoughts about this book. For those who are concerned about spoilers, I do want to say don't worry about it. I will be including spoilers later on in this video, but I'm going to kind of start, the way I'm framing this series is I'm going to start from the beginning of the book and go through specific plot points that I want to discuss more in depth. So the first few things I'll talk about will be right at the beginning of the story, so not super spoilery. And then as soon as I get to things that I feel like are a lot more spoilery, I will warn you, so those who are concerned about that can leave, and those who don't care or have read the book or whatever the case may be can stay and listen. So anyway, let's just get into this discussion. So like I said, I'm talking about The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy, which has officially become my second favorite Hardy novel. And a lot of that has to do with themes in this book that are very common in Hardy. He discusses a lot about marriage, about nature, about man's place within nature, about other types of relationships that he commonly will discuss in his books, about how little decisions and little things that happen end up causing huge waves. But I feel like this book, the rendition Hardy put in this book of those themes, really stands out to me, and I feel like is the best job that he's done on those themes. So I wanted to discuss a little bit about them. So starting from the very first scene, we start off in a way very similar to many of Hardy's other novels. He kind of describes the landscape, describes what's beautiful about it, just this grandiose explanation, this grandiose nature scene description that Hardy loves to do. And then he narrows in on a solitary figure walking down a road or something similar to that. And as this is one of my later Hardys that I've read, I only have 2 left after this one to read. So I've read quite a few of Hardy's novels, and he tends to do this a lot. And in reading this book, I kind of started to realize a little bit more why he does that, and I just find it so fascinating, especially when this book is called The Woodlanders. I really feel like it adds specifically to the story. It feels like when Hardy does this, he seems to be kind of almost very worshipful of nature, seeing it almost as this powerful divine force in life. And considering his struggles with religion and the idea of God, it makes sense that he kind of turns his worship into a worship of nature and the forces of nature. He himself never claimed to be an atheist necessarily. He kind of fell more in line with the idea of he believes there's something, some great force or something that gives life a little bit more meaning, but he doesn't necessarily believe in the Christian God, especially towards the end of his life. And so it fits very well in that his view of the world, in that he starts off from this grand explanation of nature, and it feels so powerful and strong and beautiful and just ever-present almost, and then he focuses in on this small ant of a being, this human person who is just wandering through this great expanse of everything going on, and it's almost like he's saying, look at this universe we live in, look at this world we live in, and how big it is and how huge it feels. And yet we're going to narrow in our focus on this tiny little story. Within everything else that's going on, we're going to focus in on this tiny little story that, despite how small it is, really has an impact on the people that are involved. And that's so powerful when I get into his other theme of really how small things create big waves. It feels like he's really trying to hone in on that amidst all this power and this greatness, we are living our small little lives, but they feel so impactful for us. And so I love that visual that Hardy tends to start off with. We then move into the solitary figure we're following is this barber, this local barber, who doesn't end up playing a huge role in the story, but he is going to meet this young girl named Marty, whose father is very ill at the time. He is unable to provide for their family, and so she is doing all she can to help make her father's life easier, essentially, to help support them. And she basically works late into the night so her father doesn't know that she's doing all his work for him so that they can survive. And so they're very not in a great place financially, but this barber comes and actually offers her a good sum of money for her hair. She is a very plain girl. She's described as very plain, but her hair is seen as gorgeous. It's kind of like her one beauty, to quote Little Women. And at first, she's not sure she wants to because she has a young man named Giles Winterbourne who she is in love with, and she doesn't want to lose that one bit beauty because she wants to win him over. However, later that night, she discovers that he has a betrothed, this woman, Grace Melbury, who he's been betrothed to since childhood, who has gone off to school and she's coming back soon. And because of this information, Marty decides to cut off her hair and sell it to this barber for the sake of this lady who lives in the town, a lady by the name of Mrs. Charmond, who will come into more prevalent of a role later on in the story. But anyway, this seemingly small yet significant decision ends up playing a huge role in the story, and it's very powerful because Hardy starts off focusing on Marty, and Marty really is kind of in the background of the story the entire time, but the story is not focused on her. In fact, the main character is actually Grace Melbury, this other woman who Giles, Marty's lover, or the one she loves, is in love with. And so it's kind of interesting that Hardy chose to start off with Marty, but the more I think about it, the more sense it makes, and I'll kind of get into that a little bit more in a second. But going back to the idea of small events causing big waves, this small event of her selling her hair that really, as the story continues, feels like such a small thing, ends up in a distant way being kind of the reason why certain people in the end of this book end up happy and other people do not. And it's very interesting to see how these little things, if they had been different, if they had been performed differently, if Marty hadn't heard from Grace's father that Grace was returning and that she was intended to marry Giles, if she had just decided not to sell her hair, what could have changed for these characters? So then we move into Marty's father. So like I said, he's very ill, and a huge part of what's keeping him ill is he has this great paranoid stress that just will not leave him, that this tree that's been planted in the yard, it was planted when he was a young boy, has grown, it's huge, and he's terrified that this tree is going to fall over and kill him, crush him in his own home. And actually at this point, I'm going to warn, I'm kind of starting to get into spoilery territory, so for those of you who are concerned about spoilers, feel free to leave. Thank you for watching this far, I really appreciate it. But moving, for those who don't care or who have read this or whatever, let's continue on with this. So this tree is standing there, and Dr. Fitzpiers, another prevalent character in the story, ends up coming in and suggests that they close the window and chop the tree down and then open the window and show the father that, look, the tree's gone. You don't need to worry about it anymore. They didn't want him to see them cutting it down because he'll worry that it's going to end up falling the wrong direction towards their house. So they didn't want to stress him out that way. So they decide to do this. And the shock of the tree being gone actually causes, I don't know, a heart attack or a stroke or something that causes Marty's father to die. And this causes both Giles and Marty to lose their home, as Marty's father, well, I guess it would be her great-grandfather, originally made a contract that after 3 generations in this house, of the people in this house on this land. That land that they had been tenanting, essentially, would go completely back into the hands of the owner, which is Mrs. Charmond. And Giles Winterbourne happens to be living on that land as well, so he loses his home. Marty, of course, loses her home. And this connection between these two characters is so fascinating to me because their connection all connects back to nature. Towards the end of the book, Grace describes how Marty and Giles both know the woods better than anyone, that they understand the language of the trees, is basically what she says, and that they would have been perfect together. Of course, Giles and Marty do not end up together because of reasons that we'll probably go into a little bit more in a moment, but Grace argues that they should have been together because they had this connection with nature that no one else seems to share. And it's very interesting because it feels like Marty always kind of knows this. She knows that they would be perfect together because they both understand the same things. They're both connected to nature in a way that nobody else is. However, what keeps them apart is actually Giles being distracted by Grace, specifically by her education, by her high status in life, worldly things, essentially. And because of this focus, he gets distracted in many ways from his connection with the woodland, with the trees that he is well known for and he still has, but because of that distraction, it distracts him from finding, honestly, the woman who probably would bring a lot more joy into his life than Grace ever could. And this connection with nature is shown right from this beginning, where their fates are tied to the cutting down of this tree in a little bit of a distant way, but they still are both connected to this. And the way Hardy brings that all together just shows that Giles and Marty, their lives were intertwined, and Giles just allowed himself to be distracted by things that wouldn't bring him the happiness he deserves. Which brings me to the next theme that I want to discuss a little bit more, is education. Hardy addresses education a lot in his books, and sometimes he sees it as a good thing, sometimes he sees it as a protection, but other times he recognizes that it can also be a danger. It can also cause you to forget the simple things, the things that probably are going to be worth a lot more than these grandiose, complicated aspects of life that we as humans just simply can never understand, but we try so hard to do so, and it distracts us, again, from the simple things in life that are going to bring us the most joy. I think that's a huge part of why Hardy sets most of his novels within the countryside, because he sees this simplistic country lifestyle as the ideal way to find real joy, because the more you know, the more dissatisfied with life you can be. And it's almost as if he's experienced that he's lived his life surrounded by these country folk who are uneducated, but who just live their lives. There's nothing to complicate them because they just don't understand anything better. And Hardy almost seems jealous of this characteristic of that lifestyle that he simply can't have because he has been educated, because as soon as you're educated, you can't undo it. And that becomes a huge theme in this, as we see Grace having moments where she wants to feel at home there, but she just doesn't. She just can't fully embrace this simple country lifestyle because she's experienced a higher way of living. She understands things, she knows things, and so she's unable to be completely satisfied in this life, but she desperately wants to. She has many moments where she has thoughts of, I wish I could love this, especially towards the end when Giles actually provides her with a lunch at this little rundown hotel place, little inn, when they're thinking that potentially she could get a divorce from Dr. Fitzpiers, who she does end up marrying, and she thinks she can get a divorce from him since he's been committing adultery, essentially, with Mrs. Charmond and others, and so she thinks there might be hope for her to end up with Giles the way she always should have, the way she always wishes she could have. However, she, in this moment, in this inn, while she doesn't completely despise it, she doesn't look down on it, she does feel out of place there, and she wishes she didn't. It breaks her heart. Giles, of course, thinks that it's because she's looking down her nose at it, because he, again, is distracted by this idea of education and this worldliness that she's been able to attain, and he focuses on that, whereas in her mind, she is jealous of his ability to live this simple life, to not be so extravagant as she feels like she has to be, as she's comfortable with. And it's just fascinating to see those different aspects of education, things that it can bring you, and yet that it can also be an unfortunate thing in that it could cause you to be very dissatisfied with life. Speaking of Grace's marriage to Dr. Fitzpiers, I really want to talk about, I think this is the last thing I want to talk about in this because it's already been 20 minutes that I've been rambling on, but I absolutely loved the way marriage was addressed in this book because Hardy commonly discusses marriage and finding the right person for you and all that jazz because he really struggled in his marriages, both of them. And I think he probably really thought a lot about, well, what if things had been different? What if I had ended up with someone else? What if I had known a little bit better what I wanted out of life before I had made the decision to marry my current wife, which was his first wife, Emma. But often I feel like there's this sense of like people marrying the wrong people and then they're just stuck. And it's just disheartening. But I feel like this one took a different route that I really appreciated a lot. So we see Grace get married to Dr. Fitzpiers. However, early on we are able to see that he's a bit of a philanderer. He enjoys having affairs, he enjoys women, and he's described as being one that it's not that he can't love people, it's that his love is very fleeting, essentially. He shows this by pursuing Suk or Suki, which I don't know how to pronounce her name exactly, but this young girl in town. He ends up having an affair with her right before him and Grace get married, and then we also see him kind of continue that a little bit, but then have this affair with Mrs. Charmond, who is this grand lady who does fall in love with him, and this really tears apart Grace's marriage with him. Luckily for Grace, in many ways, she never really felt in love with Dr. Fitzpiers, and so this affair doesn't really bother her in the fact that she is heartbroken for herself. It doesn't hit her personally. It's more the fact, the principle of the matter. She's upset because she can't trust her husband, because she had hoped that their relationship would be good, that it would be representative of what she had seen in her father and her stepmother. But unfortunately, Dr. Fitzpiers can't be trusted as a husband and really hurts her because of that. However, in the end, due to circumstances between Marty sending a letter to Dr. Fitzpiers about the fact that Mrs. Charmond's hair is not actually her hair, a little thing that even when when she first is writing the letter, Hardy mentions this isn't going to make that big of a difference. Marty just doesn't understand that, but then later it actually does, because Dr. Fitzpiers is getting bored with Mrs. Charmond. He decides to bring up this letter when he finds it because he thinks it's funny. He teases her about it, essentially. Mrs. Charmond gets upset and they end up having an argument and he leaves. Well, she goes chasing after him, and in the meantime, she comes across an old lover of hers who takes his revenge on her by shooting her. And so Mrs. Charmond is gone, and then we see Dr. Fitzpiers coming back to Little Hintock, and Grace panics and decides to run away. She does not want to see her husband, and she ends up going to Giles' little hut, and because of propriety reasons, he allows her to stay in his hut, but he stays outside to protect her reputation. And due to his recent illness, this causes him to get very, very ill to the point where he passes away as well. She ends up hinting to Dr. Fitzpiers that her relationship with Giles was less than proper, and in order to bother him to get him away from her, essentially. However, she later repents of this. Dr. Fitzpiers ends up discovering in his absence that he actually loves Grace more than he has ever loved any other woman, and he wants to make their marriage work. And so he starts pursuing her, he writes her letters, he comes and visits her, and at first she's very unsure, of course. But one night, when she's still pondering what she's going to do with him, she goes out to visit with him secretly because her father and him had a big argument. She doesn't want to cause any trouble with that, so she's been meeting with her husband secretly. And due to some other circumstances I won't get into here because I really need to finish off this ramble, she gets her dress caught in this little trap and gets away from it. However, she leaves part of her skirt behind, and so she goes and hides when she hears someone coming. The person coming is Dr. Fitzpiers. He sees her dress in the trap and thinks that something terrible has happened to her and begins crying about it, begins weeping for for her and showing great concern for her. And when she sees this, she ends up coming out, showing herself and explaining that she's okay, and is very touched by his clear suffering at the idea of her suffering. And this causes her to decide to give him another chance. And I think at first glance, a lot of readers would probably be like, no, he's just gonna betray you again. You can't trust him. What are you doing, Grace? But to me, something I really liked about it is there's this conversation. We're able to see them. They go to an inn. Her father ends up finding them along with some other men in the town. And, they're married, so it's not like it's super improper. They're just like, okay, I guess that's your decision. But while these men end up getting a drink before they walk home, they are discussing the whole situation. And a huge part of their discussion is that women are smart, that women understand men and their weaknesses, and that women are aware that marriage takes work, probably more than men are. And that conversation, I think, was put there because Hardy's trying to tell readers, Grace is not dumb. She knows that she can't fully trust him yet, but she's going to give it a chance because it's not like they have any other options. They can't really get a divorce unless he wants to, which it doesn't seem that he does, and that there is hope that maybe, especially as Dr. Fitzpiers really seems to feel differently to Grace than when they started. I think Grace is just saying, you know what? We're going to try to make this work because I'd rather do our best than to just let it fall apart when there's nothing else we can do. And that just shows such strength to me. I think too often in books we're shown these marriages that are easy and wonderful, and there's little tiffs here and there, but not much. And marriage is hard work because you're living a lifetime with this person that you're not always gonna like being around. And I'm not married, so I don't know firsthand, but I've seen it in my parents' lives and my uncles and aunts' lives. I've had many uncles and aunts who have gotten divorces, and my parents luckily have not. I've been blessed to have them really stick together through it all, but I've seen how they are able to work together, how when they have an argument or when they have a disagreement, they work it out. They take time to prioritize their marriage over the argument. And so it's possible, but it's also takes work. And so I feel like this book does a great job of showing, yes, Fitzpiers made horrible decisions. He cheated on his wife, and I'm one that I hate cheating in books so much, and that's why there's a lot of books like The Great Gatsby that I don't like, because I feel like it doesn't handle it very well. But I feel like this one handled it in a great way, in that it showed, yes, he did these things, but that's not the end of their marriage, and Grace is willing to give it a try, and Dr. Fitzpiers seems to be willing too. It doesn't make clear that, no, he never has an affair again. We don't know what happens. That's the point. We don't know what ends up happening, but we know that they're going to try to make it work. And there's a lot of power in that. The one last thing I want to talk about is the very last little section of this book where we see Marty. It's the first night ever that Grace has not been there with Marty to go visit Giles's grave. At least the first, they usually go every week, and it's the first time that Grace has not shown up. And Marty realizes what has happened, and she ends up going to the grave by herself, and she talks to Giles's graves and explains that it's just us now, and I'm going to be here with you for the rest of my life, essentially. And this is such a powerful scene because, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, when Marty sells her hair, that has a huge influence on the way this book goes. We see with Mrs. Charmant, it's kind of indirectly a reason why she ended up getting shot. We also see that her willingness to allow Giles and Grace to have their living situation the way it was, despite her knowledge of Giles's illness, shows that she basically put him above herself. And in making those decisions and showing that love to Giles, she kind of ends up promoting Grace and Dr. Fitzpiers' happiness while losing her own. And what I mean by that is Grace and Dr. Fitzpiers are able to come together in the end because, first of all, Mrs. Charmant is dead. And then also because not only is Giles dead, but also Grace's moment of defiance against Dr. Fitzpiers, of lying to him subtly by making him think that she had had a sexual relationship with Giles when she hadn't, kind of draws Dr. Fitzpiers back to her. He has a lot more respect for her after that. And all those things are kind of made possible because of Marty's choices. And so in the end, Dr. Fitzpiers and Grace end up coming together to work it out, to try to make things work and to find some sort of level of happiness in their marriage, while Marty is left alone and with Giles dead and buried, and she loses that joy for herself. And so while Marty is such a background character, she feels like such a background character, she kind of promotes a lot of the events that happen in this book. She's kind of the hidden director of everything that goes on, and that's just so incredible. It's almost like I said at the very beginning, going back to the very beginning of this discussion, Hardy starts off with this great big description of nature and focusing on nature and how big it is, and then slowly gets into these individual people, and the people he starts off with are background characters. So he goes from this huge presence of nature down not only to this small little story, but to the background of this story, and seems to be commenting on, again, the power that small things have in bringing great things to pass. And that's just such a powerful visual, and the way this book explores that theme along with the others I've discussed was just incredible. And that is why I just absolutely adore this book and why I'm so glad I finally got to it. So that is my thematic rambles. My arm is sore from holding that book up this whole time. This ended up being way longer than I expected it to be. So we'll see if anybody watches it. If you have made it this far, thank you so much. Please leave an emoji of fruit, some sort of fruit down below, so I know that you actually watched all the way through. I'd love to see who did, because this was a very interesting experience. But I'm really excited to continue this series. I really liked doing this, just rambling about all these thoughts I had about this book. Thought it was a lot of fun, and yeah. So again, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!